The morning sun rose gently over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped in the trees and the streets were calm, almost peaceful. But inside one modest house on the corner, the calm was only on the surface. Inside, the protagonist was busy packing boxes, moving furniture, and organizing belongings. It was a day that had been planned for weeks, a day filled with both excitement and tension. Today, the protagonist would finally move out of the neighborhood that had been home for years, but had also become a place of constant frustration. For a long time, living under the rules of the Homeowners Association, or HOA, had been difficult. At first, it had seemed like a good idea. The neighborhood looked perfect, with neatly trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and clean sidewalks. The HOA promised a beautiful, orderly community, but over time the promises had faded. The rules were strict and the fines seemed endless. A crooked flower pot, a slightly untidy front yard, or even a new mailbox that wasn't exactly the right style could lead to letters, warnings, and sometimes fees. What had started as a pleasant neighborhood had slowly turned into a place of constant surveillance and criticism. The protagonist had tried to follow all the rules. Every weekend was spent trimming hedges, painting fences, and fixing small things that no one else seemed to notice. Friends and family often joked that the protagonist had become a full-time HOA worker, but despite all efforts, complaints kept coming. The frustration built over the years, little by little, until the protagonist realized that no matter how carefully they followed the rules, it would never be enough. Something had to change. That change had come in the form of a decision. It was time to leave. The house had been bought and paid for. The mortgage was nearly finished. And now the protagonist could finally think about a fresh start somewhere else. Somewhere free from constant monitoring, endless letters, and nitpicking neighbors. Somewhere that felt like home again. It was a decision that brought relief, but also nerves. Leaving was not just about packing belongings. It was about leaving behind a chapter of life that had been stressful and exhausting. As the protagonist moved boxes into the moving truck, memories filled the air, almost as if the house itself was whispering stories from the past. There were memories of birthday parties in the backyard, summer evenings with friends grilling and laughing, and quiet mornings sipping coffee while watching the sun rise. Each item packed held a story: a worn-out toy from a childhood visit, a photograph of a family vacation framed on the wall. Even the smallest things, like a favorite mug or a pile of books, carried memories that made the act of moving bittersweet. There was excitement for the future, but also a natural sadness in leaving behind the life that had been built here. Outside, neighbors passed by, some nodding politely, others just glancing curiously at the activity. Moving out was always a noticeable event in a quiet neighborhood, and some people couldn't resist whispering to one another. The protagonist noticed it but didn't let it interfere. There was a determination to finish this day, to complete the move efficiently and peacefully. Yet the tension of the neighborhood loomed in the background. Everyone knew the HOA rules were strict, and the protagonist was aware that leaving might not be welcomed by everyone, especially those who loved to enforce those rules personally. Among the neighbors, one person stood out more than the rest. Karen, who had a reputation for being overbearing and controlling, had often been seen patrolling the neighborhood like a self-appointed monitor. Known for calling the HOA office for minor violations, Karen kept her eyes and ears open for anything unusual, and a moving truck with boxes being loaded in the driveway was exactly the kind of unusual activity she couldn't ignore. The protagonist sensed, even before speaking to her, that Karen would soon be involved. But for now, there was work to do. There was packing to finish, doors to lock, and a moving truck to fill. Inside the house, the protagonist moved from room to room, carefully wrapping fragile items and labeling boxes. Each room told a story. The living room held the history of family gatherings and late-night movie nights. The kitchen reminded the protagonist of countless meals cooked with care. Even the bedrooms held stories of growth, quiet reflection, and comfort. Packing these items required patience and thought, as it wasn't just a matter of moving things. It was a matter of carrying memories. It was almost like saying goodbye to a friend, room by room, box by box. Meanwhile, the protagonist's children helped as much as they could. They carried lighter boxes, helped organize items, and offered encouragement when things became tiring. Their energy added life to the day, but also reminded the protagonist of why leaving had become necessary. Children were growing up in a place filled with unnecessary tension and rules. The protagonist wanted better for them, a neighborhood where they could play freely without being watched or judged for every small action. The motivation to leave was not just personal. It was about creating a better environment for the family. As the day went on, the sun climbed higher in the sky, making the physical labor more exhausting. The protagonist paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, surveying the driveway filled with boxes and furniture. There was satisfaction in seeing progress, in knowing that soon this chapter of life would be behind them. But there was also anticipation, a feeling that this move might not be entirely smooth. After all, the neighborhood had a reputation for drama, and leaving could trigger reactions from those who thrived on enforcing rules and keeping everyone in line. The protagonist knew that careful handling would be required. Despite the looming possibility of conflict, the protagonist focused on the task at hand. Items were carefully packed into the moving truck. Large furniture was maneuvered out of rooms and into place, and each box was labeled with precision. There was a rhythm to the work, a methodical pace that kept the mind occupied. Packing became almost meditative, a way to stay calm amid the underlying tension. Each item placed in the truck was a small victory, a step closer to freedom from the constraints of the neighborhood rules. Neighbors who had watched from a distance began to comment quietly among themselves. Some expressed sympathy, whispering about how strict the HOA could be. Others seemed curious, perhaps even a little judgmental, about the reasons for leaving. But the protagonist paid little attention. There was a sense of purpose now, a focus on the ultimate goal, completing the move efficiently and moving forward. With each passing hour, the house became emptier, and the reality of leaving began to sink in. This was a day of endings and beginnings, a day that carried both relief and anticipation. By mid-afternoon, the majority of the house had been packed. The moving truck was nearly full, and the protagonist took a moment to rest. Sitting on the porch, a cool drink in hand, the protagonist reflected on the journey that had led to this point. Living under strict HOA rules had been a challenge, but it had also taught patience, resilience, and determination. Leaving was not just about escaping rules. It was about taking control, making decisions for the family, and choosing the kind of life they wanted. There was empowerment in that realization, a sense of strength that came from standing up for oneself. Even as the sun began to lower in the sky, the work continued. Boxes were loaded, furniture was carefully arranged, and small items were double-checked to ensure nothing was left behind. There was a feeling of accomplishment in the process, a satisfaction in seeing the house gradually empty and knowing that the next chapter awaited. The protagonist's mind occasionally drifted to thoughts of the new home, imagining a space where rules would not be oppressive and where the family could thrive in comfort and freedom. As the first part of the move came to a close, there was a quiet sense of anticipation. The protagonist knew that leaving the neighborhood would not be without challenges. There were certain individuals, particularly Karen, who had made it clear that they enjoyed enforcing rules and creating tension. It was likely that she would notice the move soon, and perhaps there would be confrontation. But for now, the protagonist focused on the positive. The progress made, the memories packed carefully, and the promise of a fresh start. By evening, the moving truck was fully loaded, and the protagonist stood back surveying the driveway. Boxes and furniture were neatly arranged, ready for the journey ahead. There was a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction, a sense that the day had been productive and that the future was bright. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the quiet street, the protagonist felt a mixture of relief and excitement. Leaving was not just a practical step. It was a symbolic act, a declaration of independence from unnecessary rules and pressures. And so, the first part of this journey ended not with confrontation, but with quiet preparation, careful packing, and the anticipation of what was to come. The house that had held so many memories was ready to be left behind, and the protagonist and family were ready to embrace freedom, knowing that the next chapter would bring both challenges and triumphs. The day had been long and tiring, but it had also been a necessary step toward a life where the family could live on their own terms, free from the constant watch of an overbearing HOA. As the sun climbed higher the next morning, the protagonist was back at the house preparing for the next stage of the move. The moving truck had been parked overnight, loaded with boxes and furniture ready for the journey to a new home. There was a sense of relief in knowing that much of the hard work had been done, but the day also brought a hint of tension. The protagonist knew that moving out of a neighborhood governed by strict HOA rules was never simple. Some neighbors had opinions about leaving, and one neighbor in particular had earned a reputation for being impossible to reason with. Karen, as she was known among residents, was the embodiment of the neighborhood's self-appointed rule enforcement. She seemed to know everyone's business and often made it her mission to report the smallest violations. From mismatched mailboxes to untrimmed hedges, Karen was always ready with a complaint. The protagonist had encountered her before, during routine interactions with the HOA, and had learned that arguing with her rarely led to resolution. Karen had a sharp tongue, a strong sense of entitlement, and a confidence that she could bend rules in her favor. Today, the protagonist sensed, she would become part of the move in a way no one wanted. Sure enough, as the protagonist moved a stack of boxes from the living room toward the truck, there was a sudden knock on the front door. The sound echoed through the quiet house. When the protagonist opened the door, there stood Karen, arms crossed, frowning, with a look that combined disbelief and annoyance. Her eyes scanned the moving boxes, the furniture on the driveway, and finally settled on the protagonist. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp and impatient. "You can't just move out like this. The HOA has rules." The protagonist tried to stay calm, taking a deep breath before responding. "I'm moving out, Karen. This is my home and I've followed all the rules. I have the right to leave whenever I choose." Karen, of course, was not satisfied. She took a step forward, pointing a finger at the protagonist. "No, you don't understand. You have obligations to the HOA. You can't just pack everything up and leave without notifying the board properly. They will be very unhappy. You might even get fined." The protagonist shook their head, a mixture of patience and frustration showing. "Karen, I've been through this. I've read the HOA documents. There are no fines for leaving the neighborhood. This is my legal right and I'm exercising it. There's no reason for any conflict here." But Karen did not seem to hear the words. She continued to insist, her voice rising slightly. "I'm just trying to help. You need to follow the proper procedures. You can't just ignore the HOA. People like you think rules don't apply and that's not acceptable." Her tone carried a mix of self-righteousness and authority, as if she believed the law of the neighborhood rested in her hands. The protagonist realized that reasoning with Karen would be difficult, if not impossible. She had always been like this, firm in her convictions, ready to argue and unwilling to see any perspective other than her own. But today the protagonist had a plan. They stayed calm, answering Karen politely but firmly. "Karen, I respect that you care about the neighborhood. I do too, but I've done everything required. There's no rule preventing me from moving. I hope you understand and will let me continue." Karen seemed unfazed, shaking her head as she stepped closer. "No, you need to stop this right now." "I'm calling the police. They will handle this situation." The protagonist's heart sank slightly, though there was also a quiet sense of confidence. They had done nothing wrong. Calling the police would not change their rights, though it would likely cause a dramatic scene. Still, the protagonist kept a calm demeanor. They had faced confrontation before and knew that staying composed was the key to resolving it, without unnecessary conflict. As Karen marched to her car, muttering about how she would not allow people to break the rules, the protagonist returned to the driveway. Moving the remaining boxes, they thought about how absurd the situation had become. Moving from a neighborhood should not require negotiation with self-appointed enforcers, yet here they were. It was a strange combination of frustration, determination, and amusement. The protagonist could almost imagine writing a story about this later. A person simply moving out of their house, and a neighbor who thought it was her duty to intervene. While waiting for the situation to unfold, the protagonist's mind drifted to the memories of the neighborhood. It had not always been this tense. When they first moved in, the community had felt welcoming. There were block parties, friendly chats over fences, and small acts of kindness from neighbors. Over time, however, things had changed. Rules had become stricter, fines had increased, and the social atmosphere had shifted from friendly to tense. Karen had been a part of this change, gradually asserting herself as a neighborhood authority figure. She had made herself heard in every HOA meeting, her voice loud and firm, often discouraging any dissent or objection. As the day progressed, The protagonist continued loading boxes into the moving truck, occasionally glancing toward Karen's house. She was now standing at her window, peering out as if watching every move. The protagonist felt a mix of irritation and amusement. It was remarkable how much energy some people put into monitoring others. Each box carried not just belongings, but also a small victory over the constant surveillance that had made daily life stressful. There was a satisfaction in knowing that, eventually, all of this effort would culminate in a move to a better place, free from judgment and rules enforced by overzealous neighbors. Hours passed and Karen finally decided to take action. She returned to the driveway, her phone in hand, dialing with determination. The protagonist watched quietly, prepared for the eventual confrontation. Karen's voice was loud, speaking rapidly into the phone, explaining the situation and describing the violation she believed was occurring. The protagonist did not intervene, knowing that the right approach was patience and calm. Calling the police might be dramatic, but it would ultimately not change their rights. This was a test of composure, a moment to show that reason and legality always outweighed unnecessary hostility. Soon, the distant sound of sirens could be heard. Karen's plan had escalated faster than the protagonist had anticipated. A police car approached slowly, the lights flashing but the atmosphere remaining calm. The protagonist continued moving boxes, maintaining a sense of order amid the chaos. They knew the officers would listen to both sides, and they felt confident that a simple explanation would be enough to resolve the situation. Karen, however, seemed certain that the arrival of law enforcement would prove her point. She gestured toward the protagonist, pointing and speaking quickly to the officers as they stepped out of the car. The protagonist greeted the officers politely, explaining the situation in calm, clear terms. "Good afternoon, officers. I am the homeowner here, and I am in the process of moving. I have followed all HOA rules and there is no violation occurring. Karen, my neighbor, has expressed concerns, but everything I am doing is within my legal rights." The officers nodded, listening attentively, taking notes and asking a few clarifying questions. Karen, meanwhile, spoke loudly, trying to dominate the conversation, but the officers maintained professionalism and focused on the facts. Throughout the discussion, the protagonist remained composed, a stark contrast to Karen's agitation. The calm demeanor, combined with clear explanations and proof of ownership, gradually shifted the situation. The officers began to understand that no laws were being broken, and that the HOA's rules did not extend to preventing a homeowner from moving. Karen's confidence began to waver as she realized her plan was not unfolding as expected. The protagonist, though tense, maintained quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that staying calm and respectful was proving more effective than yelling or arguing. As the first interaction came to a close, the officers explained to Karen that there was nothing illegal happening, and that the homeowner had every right to move out. Karen's expression shifted from anger to disbelief. She had believed her knowledge of the neighborhood rules would give her authority, but in reality, the law and property rights were clear. The protagonist returned to loading boxes, grateful for the patience and professionalism of the officers, while Karen stood on the side, fuming and muttering under her breath. By the end of the day, most of the boxes were loaded, and the protagonist had a sense of accomplishment. The confrontation, while stressful, had been handled without escalation. There was a quiet sense of triumph in knowing that the move would continue without further interference, at least for now. The neighborhood had shown its usual drama, but the protagonist had remained in control, calm and focused. Memories of past frustrations faded slightly, replaced with anticipation for a new chapter, free from overbearing oversight. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the driveway, the protagonist reflected on the events of the day. Moving was always challenging, but adding a neighbor like Karen into the mix had created unexpected tension. Yet through patience, clarity, and confidence, the protagonist had navigated the situation successfully. The boxes in the moving truck were more than just items. They represented freedom, new beginnings. The morning started quietly, with the neighborhood streets almost empty, except for the sound of birds and the distant hum of cars. The protagonist was back outside, preparing for another day of moving. The moving truck was already partially loaded from the previous day, but there were still many boxes and pieces of furniture to transfer. The day promised hard work, but also the looming sense of tension. Karen, The overbearing neighbor had made it clear yesterday that she was not going to let the move happen without interference. The protagonist knew this day could be complicated, but they were determined to stay calm and finish what had begun. As the protagonist carried another box from the living room, they noticed Karen standing across the street, arms crossed, glaring. Her expression was sharp, almost like she was waiting for a chance to pounce. She called out, her voice carrying across the quiet neighborhood. "You think you can just do whatever you want?" "I've called the police." "They'll be here any minute." The protagonist paused for a moment, setting the box down carefully, and took a deep breath. This was not a surprise. They had expected some resistance, and they had prepared themselves mentally to deal with it. Soon the distant sound of sirens grew louder, signaling the approach of the police. A squad car slowly pulled up in front of the house, its lights flashing gently in the morning sun. The officers stepped out, professional and calm, ready to assess the situation. The protagonist greeted them politely, maintaining a friendly but firm tone. "Good morning, officers. I am the homeowner, and I am in the process of moving. My neighbor Karen has called with concerns about my move, but I can assure you that I am following all the rules and have the right to move my belongings." Karen immediately began speaking, waving her hands and raising her voice, attempting to dominate the conversation. She explained in a rapid and urgent tone that the homeowner was supposedly violating the HOA rules, moving without proper permission, and potentially causing a disturbance. The protagonist could see that the officers were listening carefully, taking notes and trying to understand the situation from both perspectives. It was clear that they were trained to remain neutral and ensure the law was being followed. Rather than take sides based on emotion or complaints, the protagonist remained calm, answering the officers' questions patiently. "I purchased this home legally. I am in the process of moving out. I have notified the HOA as required. There are no fines, penalties, or legal issues preventing me from doing this. Everything I am doing is within my rights as a homeowner." The officers nodded, asking a few additional questions to confirm ownership and intent. They requested to see documentation, which the protagonist provided without hesitation. Each piece of paper, the deed, HOA correspondence, and moving permits, was presented clearly and respectfully. Karen, meanwhile, seemed increasingly frustrated. She gestured wildly, trying to convince the officers that she was right. "You don't understand. They can't just move like this. They are breaking neighborhood rules. You have to stop them." The officers listened, politely interrupting only when necessary, and asked Karen to remain calm while they verified the facts. The protagonist, observing this, realized that Karen's confidence was beginning to crack. Her certainty that the authorities would back her was being challenged by the reality of legal rights and proper documentation. As the officers finished reviewing the paperwork, they turned to Karen and explained the situation in a calm, measured tone. "Ma'am, the homeowner has provided all necessary documentation. There is no legal reason preventing them from moving out. The HOA rules do not restrict a homeowner's right to relocate. We understand your concern, but at this time, everything being done is lawful." Karen's expression shifted from indignation to disbelief. She could hardly accept that her knowledge of HOA rules did not equate to the authority she assumed. The protagonist returned to moving boxes, feeling a mix of relief and cautious anticipation. The presence of law enforcement had added tension, but it also clarified the legal boundaries. While Karen fumed on the side, the protagonist continued working efficiently, carefully loading each item into the truck. There was a rhythm to the labor, a steady pace that kept the mind occupied and prevented frustration from taking hold. Each box carried more than just belongings. It carried the promise of freedom, a new start, and relief from years of unnecessary stress. As the morning progressed, more neighbors began to notice the commotion. Some paused on the sidewalks, observing from a distance. Whispers floated across lawns, speculating about the situation and the escalating drama. It was as if the entire neighborhood had become a silent audience, watching a story unfold that combined legality, tension, and personal confrontation. The protagonist, however, remained focused, taking the long view and ignoring the gossip. Their priority was completing the move safely and efficiently. Karen, unwilling to accept the reality, continued to hover near the driveway. Her face was tense, her jaw tight, and her hands clenched at her sides. She muttered repeatedly, insisting that the officers had to do something to stop the move. But the officers remained calm. reiterating that the homeowner had every legal right to continue. Slowly, Karen's confidence began to diminish. The certainty she had felt when calling the police was replaced by a sense of confusion and growing frustration. She had assumed authority, but authority without legal standing was powerless. During a brief pause, the protagonist took a moment to talk to the officers. "I understand she is persistent," they said, gesturing toward Karen. "She often overreacts. I just want to make sure everything continues safely. I appreciate your help in clarifying the legal situation so there is no misunderstanding." The officers nodded, acknowledging the comment. Their presence had already prevented escalation, and their professionalism provided reassurance that the move would continue without incident. Meanwhile, the family worked together efficiently. Children carried smaller boxes, while the protagonist handled the heavier furniture. Each movement was careful and deliberate, ensuring that nothing was damaged and that the process remained orderly. There was teamwork, laughter, and occasional reminders to lift carefully or watch the edges of the furniture. Despite the tension with Karen, the day carried a sense of purpose and progress. Each box loaded was a step closer to freedom, a step away from constant surveillance and unnecessary rules. As the moving truck filled, Karen began pacing, clearly trying to find another angle to interfere. She approached the officers again, speaking quickly and sharply, pointing at the boxes. "You have to stop them. You don't understand. They are ignoring the rules." The officers responded patiently, maintaining professionalism. "Ma'am, we understand your concern, but we have reviewed all documentation. There is nothing illegal occurring. Please step back and allow the homeowners to continue." Karen's face showed a mix of disbelief and irritation. For the first time, she realized that her influence had limits, and that legal authority outweighed personal insistence. The protagonist continued loading the truck, glancing occasionally at Karen and the officers. There was a sense of quiet satisfaction in handling the situation calmly. The tension, though present, was manageable. The officers remained attentive, the neighbors continued observing, and Karen's authority had been challenged in a way that was both visible and undeniable. For the protagonist, the experience was a reminder that patience, clarity, and proper preparation were more powerful than anger, shouting, or assumptions of control. By mid-afternoon, the majority of the furniture and boxes had been loaded into the truck. The protagonist paused for a moment, wiping sweat from their brow and taking in the scene. Karen was still present, standing at a distance and muttering under her breath, but her energy seemed drained. The officers remained calm and professional, and the moving process was progressing steadily. There was relief in seeing the tangible results of hard work and preparation, as well as a quiet satisfaction in witnessing the limits of Karen's influence. The protagonist's mind wandered briefly to the future. Soon this neighborhood would be behind them, replaced with a new home, new opportunities, and a sense of freedom that had been absent for years. The tension with Karen, while dramatic, was only a temporary obstacle. The real victory lay in preparation, patience, and knowing one's rights. Each box in the truck was a small symbol of independence, a reminder that challenges, no matter how persistent, could be handled with grace and composure. As the day drew to a close, the moving truck was nearly full. The protagonist, exhausted but satisfied, took a deep breath and looked around the driveway. Karen was still standing nearby, arms crossed, fuming quietly. The officers, having ensured that everything was in order, returned to their car and nodded politely. With the police gone, the protagonist focused on the final boxes, carefully stacking them and securing items for transport. The sense of accomplishment was strong. The move was almost complete, and the tension had been managed effectively. The evening light cast long shadows across the driveway, highlighting the moving truck and the last remaining boxes. The protagonist paused, reflecting on the events of the day. Moving had always been a difficult process, but adding Karen into the mix had transformed it into a dramatic. The next morning, the air was crisp and quiet, almost serene, but inside the house there was a low hum of activity. The protagonist had spent the previous day moving the majority of boxes and furniture into the truck, yet a few key items remained inside, along with some packing supplies. The driveway was still partially crowded, with Karen visible across the street, peering from her porch as if she had taken up permanent residence there. Her eyes followed every movement, and the protagonist knew that any careless action could trigger another confrontation. Despite the tension, there was determination and focus. Today would be the day the move was completed, no matter what obstacles appeared. As the protagonist carried a heavy box from the living room, the sound of a car pulling up the driveway caught their attention. They turned to see a familiar vehicle approaching, and a mixture of relief and anticipation filled their chest. It was the son returning from his shift. But this was no ordinary arrival. The son, a police officer, stepped out of the car in uniform, badge visible, and greeted the family with a calm, professional smile. "Hey, Dad, Mom. I heard there might be a bit of tension out here. Need a hand?" The protagonist felt a wave of reassurance. The son's presence added not just strength but authority. Karen, who had been observing everything from her porch, stiffened immediately. Her confident posture wavered as she noticed the uniform and the badge gleaming in the morning sunlight. She stepped closer, calling out loudly, "You can't just move like this." The rules still apply. The son, however, remained calm and composed. There was no anger, only a quiet confidence that immediately changed the energy of the scene. The protagonist gestured to the son, whispering, "I think you already know what's happening." The son nodded, walking slowly toward Karen with measured steps. His presence seemed to command attention without a word, and the neighbors who had gathered across the street paused to watch. Karen's confidence, which had been bolstered by years of overbearing behavior and self-assumed authority, began to crumble. She had faced homeowners, neighbors, and even police officers before, but now she was confronted by someone whose authority was official, visible, and unquestionable. "Ma'am," the son began, speaking clearly and professionally, "I'm Officer Son's name. I understand you have concerns, but there is no violation occurring. My parents have every right to move out of their home. The HOA rules do not prevent them from leaving, and there are no legal issues involved." Karen's mouth opened and closed, as if searching for words that could counter the reality she was facing, but none came. Her usual arguments, so confident and loud, now sounded empty and hollow against the undeniable presence of authority. The protagonist continued moving boxes, but their focus occasionally flicked to Karen. She was now pacing slightly, muttering to herself and waving her hands, trying desperately to reclaim control. The son's calm demeanor, however, only amplified the absurdity of her actions. He continued speaking firmly yet respectfully, outlining the legal facts: homeowners' rights, property ownership, and the limits of HOA authority. Each point he made chipped away at Karen's certainty, revealing the gap between her assumptions and reality. The gathered neighbors could not help but notice the shift. What had seemed like another routine confrontation with Karen had transformed into a dramatic scene. People whispered to one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling quietly at the irony. The power dynamics had completely changed. Karen, who had once stood tall as the enforcer of neighborhood rules, now appeared small and uncertain, unsure how to respond to someone who spoke with authority, knowledge, and calm confidence. Meanwhile, the protagonist's children worked alongside their parents, carefully lifting boxes and organizing items for loading. The atmosphere, while tense with Karen's presence, carried a sense of teamwork and determination. Each box loaded was a step toward finishing the move, and every moment of progress reminded the family that persistence and preparation outweighed unnecessary confrontation. The son, occasionally lending a hand with heavier items, maintained a watchful eye on Karen, ensuring that the situation remained under control without escalating unnecessarily. Karen attempted to speak again, her voice rising in frustration. "You can't just show up in a uniform and tell me what to do. This doesn't change anything. I'm still right." The son, however, did not raise his voice. Instead, he calmly explained, "Ma'am, I am not here to argue personally. I am here to clarify the legal situation. Your concern is noted, but it does not give you authority over how they manage their property or their move. Please allow the process to continue." The firmness in his voice, combined with his visible badge, was enough to silence her. She fumed quietly, realizing that her influence had limits she had never before encountered. As the morning progressed, the family continued their work, loading the last of the large furniture and securing boxes inside the truck. The neighbors watched quietly, some offering supportive nods and encouraging smiles. Karen remained present, standing near the edge of the driveway, her arms crossed, muttering under her breath. But she no longer attempted direct confrontation. The son occasionally glanced at her, his presence alone a reminder that overbearing behavior had consequences when met with authority and calm professionalism. The protagonist felt a mixture of pride and relief. Pride in seeing their child handle a tense situation with such poise and professionalism, and relief in knowing that the final stage of the move could proceed without the disruptions that had complicated the previous days. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching Karen's arrogance deflate, replaced by a dawning realization that rules, authority, and confrontation were not the same. Legal rights and preparation carried far more weight than self-appointed power. During a brief pause, the son spoke with the protagonist privately. "You've done everything right," he said quietly. "She can't legally stop you from moving. Just stay calm, finish loading, and we'll get everything into the truck safely. I'll stay nearby just to make sure she doesn't try anything else." The protagonist nodded, feeling reassured. The son's presence was more than a help. It was a shield, a way to prevent escalation and ensure the family could finish what they had started. Karen, sensing her authority slipping further, finally stepped back, trying one last feeble attempt to assert control. "I'm telling you, the HOA will take action. You can't just ignore the rules." The son, standing firmly and speaking calmly, responded, "Ma'am, the HOA cannot prevent them from moving. The move is legal and authorized. Please step aside and allow the family to continue." Karen's expression shifted from defiance to helplessness. For the first time, she realized that authority must be grounded in fact, not assumption, and that her usual tactics had no effect in the face of clear legal rights. With the road now clear, the family focused on finishing the move. Boxes were lifted and secured, furniture carefully arranged in the truck, and smaller items placed strategically to avoid damage. There was a sense of rhythm, teamwork, and accomplishment. The son remained near Karen, ensuring no further interruptions occurred, but otherwise contributed quietly, lifting heavier items and assisting where needed. Each movement reinforced the sense that preparation, patience, and calm professionalism were more powerful than confrontation or aggression. By midday, the truck was fully loaded. The protagonist paused for a moment, wiping sweat from their brow, taking in the scene. The driveway was clear, the house ready for final checks, and the neighborhood seemed to settle into an unusual calm. Karen, still standing nearby, looked defeated. Her face showed frustration, disbelief, and perhaps a touch of shame. The neighbors who had been watching quietly dispersed, their whispers replaced by smiles and nods of acknowledgement. The dramatic confrontation had reached its resolution, and the protagonist felt a deep sense of satisfaction in seeing justice and preparation prevail over overbearing behavior. As the family gathered for a brief break, the son addressed Karen one final time. "Ma'am, I understand your concern for the neighborhood, but your actions today have no legal standing. Please allow the family to finish their move peacefully. This is their right." Karen muttered something under her breath but made no further attempt to interfere. Her authority, which had felt absolute for so long, was no more. The protagonist felt a mixture of relief and quiet amusement. It was an unusual moment, dramatic yet satisfying, and a story that the family would remember for years. With the truck now ready, the family took one last look at the house, feeling a mix of nostalgia and excitement. The son offered a few final words of encouragement. "You've handled everything perfectly. Now it's time to move forward. Safe travels." The protagonist nodded, feeling grateful for the support and proud of the way the situation had been managed. The move, which had started with tension and uncertainty, was now on the final path to completion, free from unnecessary interference. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the driveway as the family finished the last preparations. Karen, still visible across the street, had finally given up, watching silently but no longer attempting to challenge or interrupt. The protagonist felt a sense of empowerment and relief. The morning light filled the driveway with a warm glow as the protagonist and family prepared for the final stage of their move. The truck was loaded, the last few boxes carefully secured, and the house nearly empty. After days of hard work, tension, and unexpected drama with Karen, the family was finally ready to leave the neighborhood behind. There was a mixture of excitement, relief, and anticipation in the air. The move had been more complicated than anyone could have imagined, but today marked the beginning of a fresh chapter in their lives. The protagonist walked around the house one last time, checking doors, windows, and ensuring that nothing was left behind. Each room, now empty, seemed to whisper memories of the past, quiet reminders of birthdays celebrated, family gatherings, and simple, everyday moments that had made this house a home. While there was a sense of nostalgia, it was accompanied by excitement for the future. The neighborhood, with its strict HOA rules and overbearing neighbors, was behind them. Ahead lay freedom, new opportunities, and the ability to live without constant scrutiny. Karen, of course, had not disappeared entirely. She stood across the street, arms crossed, watching the final preparations with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. The son, still in uniform, stood nearby, calmly observing her from a distance. Her attempts to interfere had already been challenged and neutralized, and today she seemed to realize that the family's determination could not be stopped. She muttered to herself, her voice barely audible over the sound of boxes being loaded and furniture secured. The protagonist felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that the efforts to move forward had been met with persistence and preparation. As the last box was carefully placed in the truck, the family paused for a brief moment of reflection. The son spoke first, his tone calm and supportive. "Everything is in order. You've handled this perfectly. Today marks a new beginning, and no one can take that away from you." The protagonist nodded, smiling, feeling proud of the resilience and teamwork displayed over the past days. The children, carrying the lighter boxes earlier, now stood nearby, excited for the journey ahead and relieved that the tension with Karen had finally eased. The neighbors who had gathered across the street began to watch more quietly, some nodding in acknowledgement, others whispering softly. The events of the past few days had become the talk of the neighborhood, a story that would be shared for weeks to come. Karen's presence, once intimidating, now seemed almost comical in comparison to the calm and organized approach of the family. The protagonist felt a mixture of amusement and relief. Moving out had been a challenge, but the way the family had handled every obstacle, including the confrontation with Karen, had made the experience empowering rather than purely stressful. With the truck finally ready, the protagonist and son worked together to secure the doors and double-check the load. Everything was arranged carefully, ensuring that boxes and furniture would remain safe during the drive. The children helped by holding doors, carrying smaller items to the edge of the driveway, and offering encouragement. There was laughter and conversation, a feeling of accomplishment mingling with excitement for what lay ahead. The move, which had begun with tension and uncertainty, was now approaching its satisfying conclusion. Karen, now silent, watched as the family prepared to leave. She made no further attempts to interfere. Her face showed frustration, but also a dawning realization that her influence had limits. She had tried to assert control, to enforce rules that were never hers to enforce, but the family's knowledge of their rights, combined with calm, composed action, had prevailed. The son, standing nearby, gave her a polite nod, acknowledging her concern but firmly signaling that the situation was settled. Karen's body language shifted slightly, a sign that the confrontation was over, at least for now. The protagonist took a deep breath, walking toward the truck one last time. Memories of the past few days, weeks, and even years flooded their mind. The frustrations, the careful planning, the moments of tension, and the eventual victories. It had not been easy, but each step of preparation had been worthwhile. Standing in front of the moving truck, the protagonist felt a mixture of pride, relief, and anticipation. Today was the culmination of persistence, patience, and a refusal to allow unnecessary drama to dictate their life. As the truck engine started and the family climbed inside, there was a moment of quiet reflection. The streets of the neighborhood, once filled with a sense of pressure and constant oversight, now seemed almost peaceful. The protagonist looked back at the house one last time, feeling gratitude for the memories created there and excitement for the possibilities ahead. The son in the driver's seat of the moving truck offered a reassuring smile. "We're ready," he said simply. The words carried weight, signaling both closure and new beginnings. The journey away from the neighborhood was filled with conversation, laughter, and shared excitement. The children pointed out familiar landmarks, recalling memories from their time in the area, while the protagonist and son discussed plans for the new home, imagining how the space would be arranged and the ways in which life would feel freer and more relaxed. The tension of the past days gradually gave way to anticipation, hope, and a sense of empowerment. Moving had been a challenge, but it had also been a reminder of the family's resilience and ability to face obstacles together. Meanwhile, Karen remained behind, a figure of quiet observation from across the street. Though she had attempted to assert control, she had been met with patience, knowledge, and authority that she could not overcome. The protagonist knew that she would likely tell neighbors about the events, but that no longer mattered. The family had handled the situation with dignity and composure, and the validation came from within, not from external approval. Karen's attempts to dominate had been neutralized, and the family could continue forward without fear or unnecessary interference. Arriving at the new home, the family began the process of unloading boxes and furniture. The work was challenging, but the energy was entirely different from the past days. There was excitement, creativity, and a sense of freedom in organizing the new space exactly as they wanted. Each item unpacked, each piece of furniture placed, was a step toward a life that was less stressful and more fulfilling. The son continued to help, his presence offering both practical support and reassurance that any challenge could be met calmly and effectively. As the day went on, the family took breaks, enjoying snacks and sharing stories about the past week's events. The tension, the confrontation with Karen, and the challenges of moving all became part of a story they could laugh about together. There was pride in knowing they had handled the situation correctly, and relief in the knowledge that the move was complete. The neighborhood with strict rules and unnecessary scrutiny was behind them, replaced by a space where they could live freely, comfortably, and without constant pressure. Evening arrived, casting a soft golden light over the new home. The family paused to take in the surroundings, feeling a sense of accomplishment and renewal. The son, still present, offered one final word of encouragement. "You did everything right. You handled it calmly, legally, and effectively. Now you can enjoy your new home without worry." The protagonist felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the son's support, but for the family's teamwork, determination, and ability to face challenges with patience and integrity. As the night settled, the protagonist reflected on the lessons learned. Moving out of a neighborhood had not just been about relocating, it had been about standing up for one's rights, handling conflict with composure, and trusting in preparation and knowledge. The confrontation with Karen had been dramatic, but it had also reinforced the importance of calm, clear action in the face of unreasonable behavior. The family had emerged victorious not through aggression or argument, but through persistence, patience, and the support of one another. By the end of the evening, the last box was unpacked, furniture arranged, and the family settled comfortably in the new home. There was a quiet sense of triumph, a realization that the challenges of the past were behind them, and a strong feeling of hope for the future. The neighborhood rules, overbearing neighbors, and confrontations were no longer part of daily life. In their place was freedom, a sense of security, and the ability to create a life on their own terms. The protagonist sat quietly, reflecting on the journey. It had been exhausting, stressful, and at times tense, but it had also been rewarding. The family had faced adversity together, maintained composure, and handled every challenge with care and integrity. Karen's overbearing behavior, which had once seemed intimidating, had been overcome through patience, knowledge, and authority. The family's resilience had turned a stressful move into an empowering experience, and the new home represented both a literal and symbolic fresh start. As the night deepened and the family settled in for their first evening in the new home, there was laughter, conversation, and a sense of peace. The move had been completed, challenges had been met, and the family was ready to embrace life without unnecessary interference. Karen, far away in the old neighborhood, had been silenced by reality,